Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to look at the time right now, because just a few minutes ago, the landscape of American politics was shaken by a terrifying earthquake, a moment that Donald Trump will likely never want to remember for the rest of his life. The heavy doors of the United States Supreme Court have just slammed shut, but the aftershocks are spreading at breakneck speed from Washington all the way to Wall Street. This is no longer the stuff of rumors. These are no longer vague analyses. This is the naked truth. Donald Trump has just suffered the most painful, brutal, and destructive defeat since he first stepped foot into the White House. In a decision that has stunned top legal experts across the nation, the Supreme Court has issued a ruling with an overwhelming 7-2 vote, flatly rejecting, yes, let me repeat that, completely rejecting the claim of absolute presidential immunity that Mr. Trump has clung to as his final life raft. But ladies and gentlemen, what has the entire nation holding its breath isn't just that cold, hard 7-2 number. The thing that is truly shocking, the thing that feels like a knife driven straight into the heart of the Trump legal team strategy, is the specific identity of the people who voted against him. Imagine the feeling washing over Trump right at this very second as he looks at that list. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. 3 names, 3 justices he personally selected, 3 people he handpicked and elevated to the pinnacle of judicial power with the ironclad belief that they would serve as his firewall when the storms hit. But no, in this life or death hour, his own family has turned their backs on him. They chose the Constitution over personal loyalty, a betrayal, or the awakening of justice. Call it what you will, but for Donald Trump, this is a fatal blow, an internal collapse that no strategist could have possibly foreseen. And right in the eye of this chaotic storm, as Trump's law offices are scrambling like a disturbed beehive, another earth-shattering event has occurred simultaneously. Warren Buffett, the sage of Omaha, the most powerful man on Wall Street, a man famous for his few words and for always keeping a safe distance from political quagmires, has suddenly broken his years-long silence. He has spoken up, and ladies and gentlemen, the words he uttered were not your standard social pleasantries. They were stern warnings, sharp as a razor, sending an electric shock down the spine of the American financial and political establishment. Why would Warren Buffett choose this incredibly sensitive moment to speak out? Why would a man as cautious as he is decide to step into the war zone? Because he sees something that many others have not yet realized. This is no longer simply a legal battle concerning one individual. This ruling and Trump's reaction to it signals the total collapse of the defense system, and more dangerously, it threatens the very foundation of stability that the American economy relies upon. Buffett understands that when the shield of invincibility shatters, what follows will be an unstoppable domino effect. The atmosphere in Washington right now is thick with tension. The calculations have failed. The promises of absolute protection have vanished into thin air. Trump now stands alone in the middle of the storm, stripped of the immunity armor he thought would shield him forever. And Warren Buffett's words are ringing out like a death nail for any last hope of turning the tide. We are standing on the threshold of a new phase 1 that promises to be more brutal and fierce than anything we have seen before. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the clock is ticking louder than ever before. What happens in the next 70 hours could very well decide whether a former president of the United States ends up sitting in a cold federal prison cell or remains a free man. The margin for error has vanished. So let me take a moment to explain to you, calmly but with brutal clarity, exactly what is happening behind those closed doors right now and why panic is beginning to set in. For the past 2 years, Donald Trump has meticulously constructed what he referred to as an unbreakable legal fortress. Since the moment the federal indictments dropped in 2023, like a hammer, he has deployed every conceivable tactic, thrown every possible wrench into the gears of justice. He talked about executive privilege as if it were a divine right. He invoked presidential immunity as if it were a magic spell. He even went so far as to claim that the special counsel didn't even have the legal right to exist. It was a strategy of total obstruction designed to delay, deny, and destroy the proceedings against him. His team of high-priced lawyers, featuring heavy hitters like Todd Blanche and Chris Casey, truly believed, or at least they managed to convince themselves, that the president, and specifically Donald Trump, was meant to be untouchable by the law. Whenever the conversation turned to the secret documents at Mar-a-Lago or the events of January 6th or election interference, Trump repeated the same mantra like a broken record. I was president, therefore I am protected.
It was a belief system that bordered on delusion, a conviction that the title of the office was a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. But today, reality has caught up with everyone with the force of a runaway freight train.
After 18 months of federal maneuvers and endless appeals, look at where Trump stands. He is no longer safe behind his fortress. He finds himself surrounded by hearings on every side. He is staring at legal bills that are spiraling out of control, exceeding $100 million, a staggering sum that has turned his presidential campaign into little more than a special piggy bank to pay his attorneys. The billionaire is burning through cash to stay out of court, but the courts are closing in. All of this chaos, all of this noise exists because Trump and the American justice system have been locked in a collision course over one massive fundamental question. Can a former president be judged for what he did while in the Oval Office? Or does the presidency elevate a man above the very laws he swore to execute? And right in the middle of this brutal cage match sits the Supreme Court. This is an institution that is supposed to remain high above the muddy waters of politics, a beacon of neutrality. But Trump dragged them into the mud. Remember, he appointed three of them, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. He didn't just appoint them. He thought he owned them. He believed they were his ace in the hole, his ultimate safety net. The court had made decisions favorable to him in the past, leading him to believe they were on Team Trump. But granting him total immunity, that would have been a step too far. That would have been equivalent to crowning him King of America, effectively declaring that the justice system does not apply to the man in charge. And as we have just seen, even his own appointees couldn't bring themselves to cross that line. The fortress has crumbled, the walls have fallen, and for the first time in this long saga, Donald Trump is exposed. To understand the sheer magnitude of this miscalculation, we have to rewind the tape to last October. Back then, Donald Trump wasn't just confident. He was exuding an aura of arrogant invincibility. He looked the American people in the eye and dismissed the very idea that his judges could ever vote against him as fake news. He didn't just hope for their support. He demanded it as a return on investment. He told anyone who would listen that real judges understand presidential power. He went even further, suggesting that any judge who voted otherwise would be practically betraying the Constitution, at least the Constitution as he understood it. And he wasn't saying this in hushed whispers behind closed doors at Mar-a-Lago. No, he was shouting it from the rooftops, declaring it before roaring crowds at his rallies. He constantly reminded the world that he was the one who appointed three justices, subtly and sometimes not so subtly, implying that they owed him something. They owed him a debt. Legal experts watched this spectacle with their jaws on the floor. It raised a terrifying question. Can a president openly pressure the highest court in the land like a mob boss leaning on a local magistrate? But here is the ugly truth that everyone seems to forget until it is too late. This wasn't the first time we've seen this play out. Trump has proven time and time again that he is loyal to exactly one person, himself. The moment someone ceases to be useful, or worse, the moment they follow the law instead of his orders, he flips a switch. He transforms from their biggest champion into their vicious executioner. Just look at the trail of bodies he has left behind. Remember Jeff Sessions. Trump once called him a brilliant legal mind. But the moment Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation, an act required by ethics rules, Trump destroyed him. One day Sessions was great, the next he was disloyal, weak, and mentally incapacitated. Then there was Bill Barr. Trump loved Barr as long as Barr was acting as his shield. But the second Barr stated the simple fact that there was no widespread election fraud. Trump turned on him with a vengeance, calling him lazy and a coward. This is the pattern. This is the cycle. Trump thought he could manage the Supreme Court the same way he manages a construction contractor or a hotel employee. He thought he could bully them into submission. But the Supreme Court just reminded him that the law is not an employee you can fire, and the Constitution is not a contract you can renegotiate when the terms no longer suit you. If you need further proof of how dangerous this game of loyalty is, look no further than the man who stood faithfully by Trump's side for 4 long years, Mike Pence. When Pence refused to overturn the election results on January 6th, an act he had no legal authority to do anyway. Trump didn't just disagree with him, he erased him. He distanced himself from Pence as if the vice president had never existed. But it got much darker than that. Trump sat back and watched as a furious mob turned against his own vice president, chanting for his execution. It showed the world that even the people closest to the center of power could become targets in a single second. Kevin McCarthy experienced the exact same whiplash. Remember when he criticized Trump immediately after January 6th? Trump went from calling him my Kevin to threatening to destroy his entire political career. McCarthy eventually bent the knee, but the lesson was learned. Defiance is fatal. And now it is his own Supreme Court justices, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, who find themselves in this perilous position. By following the law, they have unknowingly stepped into the crosshairs. This repetitive behavior reveals a fundamental flaw in Trump's worldview. He truly thought he could control the judicial branch of the United States government the same way you control a building or a private corporation. But the Supreme Court just sent a reminder that the law is not a toy, and no one, not even a former president, is above the rules. And this brings us back to the bombshell dropped by Warren Buffett. Why is his reaction so critical right now? Because people are finally understanding that this isn't just a legal problem anymore. It is a moment where the political and economic future of the United States could change in the blink of an eye. Buffett knows that markets run on confidence. They run on stability. When trust in the institutions begins to fall, everything can collapse very quickly. Even for someone who believed he was untouchable, the ground is shifting. Trump's belief that 40 years of loyalty or past favors would save him has been proven wrong. The sage of Omaha is signaling that the chaos Trump brings is bad for business, bad for the dollar, and bad for America. When you have a leader who is willing to let a mob turn on his vice president or attack the very judges he appointed, you create an environment of unpredictability. And if there's one thing Wall Street hates more than taxes, it is unpredictability. The warning from Buffett suggests that we are looking at a potential systemic failure. If the rule of law is optional for the man at the top, then contracts mean nothing, regulations mean nothing, and the stability that investors crave evaporates. Trump is finding out the hard way that you cannot bully the Constitution and you cannot bluff the economy. But as his legal walls crumble, his reaction is becoming more volatile. And that is what has everyone from the halls of justice to the trading floors of New York on high alert. So what exactly did the Supreme Court do to send Donald Trump into such a blind rage? To understand the fury, we have to peel back the layers and look at the heart of the argument. This wasn't a dispute about a parking ticket, a tax error, or a minor procedural technicality. This was a battle for the very soul of the Constitution itself. The entire case revolved around a single terrifying question. Can a president claim total immunity for acts that might be criminal simply because he committed them while sitting in the Oval Office? Trump's legal team walked into that courtroom with a strategy that can only be described as audacious. They essentially demanded that the justices rewrite the rules of American democracy. They wanted the court to declare in black and white that the president is functionally above all laws during his tenure. They argued that he can never be prosecuted, never be touched, and never be held accountable.
Even after leaving the White House, the special counsel Jack Smith stood up and dismantled this idea with a simple, powerful truth. He explained that granting this request would not just protect a president, it would crown a king. It would create a ruler who answers to no one, a man who operates outside the bounds of the justice system. The justices, therefore, were faced with a binary choice. Either they validate Trump's desire to be untouchable, or they reaffirm the foundational American belief that no man, no matter how powerful, is above the law. As predicted, Trump's team didn't play it safe. They went for the Hail Mary. They chose the most extreme position possible, arguing for immunity without any limits, without any boundaries. It was as if they believed the Supreme Court's primary function was to serve as Trump's personal bodyguard rather than the guardian of the law. At the beginning of the oral arguments, the tension was palpable. Some judges seemed hesitant, asking tough, uncomfortable questions about the slippery slope of prosecuting former leaders. They worried about the precedent it might set. But as the clock ticked on and the arguments deepened, the cracks in Trump's logic became canyons. The problems became impossible to ignore. Legal scholars from across the political spectrum began to point out the absolute absurdity of Trump's position. Historians stepped in to remind everyone that the Founding Fathers fought a bloody revolution specifically to get rid of a king, not to create a new elected one. Even conservative commentators, people who usually align with Trump's policies, started to squirm in their seats. They began to feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a president who recognizes no limits. The sheer audacity of the argument was beginning to backfire, turning what Trump thought was a shield into a sword that was slowly turning against him. While Trump's legal team remained frozen in their extreme stance, refusing to budge an inch, the American public began to see the flashing red lights. The danger was becoming undeniable. Across the country, polling data
started to reflect a significant shift. A vast majority of citizens, regardless of their political affiliation, began to voice a common sentiment. A president should not be allowed to commit illegal acts without facing the consequences. The court of public opinion was rendering its verdict before the gavel even fell, and this is where the dynamic shifted inside the marble halls of the Supreme Court. The justices began to feel the heat. You have to understand, the Supreme Court is an institution that is obsessed with its own image, its reputation, and its historical legacy. They view themselves as the sacred protectors of the Constitution, the last line of defense against chaos. They absolutely dread the idea of being perceived as a group of partisan hacks, a mere extension of the Republican Party, or worse, a group of lackeys who only defend the man who appointed them. They do not want their legacy in the history books to be written as the judges who obeyed, but rather as the judges who judged. Chief Justice John Roberts, in particular, has spent his entire tenure trying to convince the world that the court is apolitical. He knew that granting Trump absolute immunity would destroy that credibility forever. It would confirm the worst fears of the critics that the court had been captured. So they made their choice. They took their stand. And for Donald Trump, this decision wasn't just a legal ruling. It was a massive personal provocation. He had operated under the assumption that he had bought their loyalty. He thought they were there to protect him. But the result was a catastrophe for his defense.
The 7-2 decision hit like a thunderclap. Chief Justice Roberts penned an opinion that many legal experts are calling incredible for its clarity and directness. He stripped away the ambiguity.
He cut through the noise. When the news of this text reached Trump, reports indicate he flew into an immense rage. You see, in Trump's binary world, there are only friends and enemies. There is no middle ground for impartiality. To him, a judge who votes against him is weak. A judge who fails to protect him is a traitor. The concept of judicial independence is foreign to him. The moment a judge simply applies the law, the same law that applies to you or me, Trump views it as a personal attack. He treats them as an enemy combatant. And this reaction has pushed him into a dangerous corner. Now Trump finds himself trapped. He desperately needs the court to shield him from federal prison. He needs their intervention to delay the trials. But at the same time, his ego won't allow him to stop insulting the very people he needs the most. He is biting the hand that holds his fate. This situation illustrates once again the fatal flaw in Trump's psychology. Loyalty only works in one direction. It flows up to him, but never down from him. The moment the rules don't bend in the direction he wants, he prefers to burn the whole house down and accuse everyone of corruption rather than accept the cold, hard reality of the law.
While the Supreme Court calmly tries to remind the nation that no one stands above it, not even a former commander-in-chief Donald Trump finds himself plunged into a situation of unimaginable complexity.
The legal landscape has shifted beneath his feet. The federal cases brought against him are not vague theories. They are solid evidence-based indictments. And now, without the shield of absolute immunity he so desperately wanted to keep, he is exposed. He must face the full weight of the law just like any other citizen accused of a crime, regardless of how deeply that reality offends his sense of self-importance. This is the moment of truth. He is being forced to accept a reality that contradicts his entire life philosophy, that even the judges he personally appointed cannot simply close their eyes to the Constitution just to do him a favor. They cannot bend reality to please him.
This ruling forces him onto a standard legal path, stripping away the special treatment he feels entitled to. It compels him to recognize, perhaps for the first time, that the rules actually apply to everyone.
And this realization puts him in a brutal bind, stuck between two agonizing choices. On one hand, he can continue to attack the judges. He can scream about corruption and bias, but doing so destroys his remaining relationships with the conservative legal establishment, the very people he might need in the future. If he alienates the jurists who are naturally inclined to support conservative causes, he isolates himself completely. On the other hand, he could choose to accept the Supreme Court's decision. But for Trump, this is almost impossible. Accepting the ruling would be admitting that he is not above the law. It would mean admitting defeat. It would cause a visible crack in this carefully curated image of the strong man who never retreats, never surrenders, and never loses. To bow to the court is to show weakness before the entire country, and weakness is the one thing he fears more than prison. He has created this difficulty himself. It is a trap of his own making, because he demands total unquestioning loyalty from everyone around him, but offers none in return. He eventually runs out of allies. He accuses and attacks the moment things don't go his way, throwing even his most staunch defenders under the bus the minute they are no longer useful. This creates a climate of tremendous fear within his inner circle. When his own Supreme Court justices publicly reject his immunity claims, his remaining political allies are watching in terror. They are asking themselves, if he can turn on them, am I next? Will I be the next one abandoned or insulted? This fear is palpable, especially among moderate Republicans. These are the people who were hoping for a softer solution, a way to move past the Trump era without blowing up the party. Now, they are trembling at the idea of being associated with his attacks on the institutions. They see the ship sinking, and they are terrified that Trump will drag them down with him as he flails against the judiciary. While the moderates tremble in silence, the reaction on the other side of the political spectrum among the most extreme partisans is fueling a fire that threatens to consume the entire discourse. These supporters aren't reading the legal opinions. They aren't looking at the constitutional nuances. Instead, they have convinced themselves that the Supreme Court justices, including the conservative icons, have become traitors. They believe these judges are now controlled by a shadowy, hidden system, the mythical deep state. This narrative is pouring gasoline on an already raging fire, aggravating the anger and deepening the chaos across the country. But the situation truly took a turn for the worse when we saw cracks forming in the most unexpected places. Take Lindsey Graham, for example.
For years, Senator Graham has been one of Trump's most steadfast allies, his golf partner, his defender, and chief on cable news. Yet even Graham had to draw a line in the sand.
He detached himself from the former president on this issue, stating publicly that Trump's attacks against the Supreme Court were too violent and dangerous. When you lose a loyalist like Lindsey Graham on a specific issue, it is a flashing red siren indicating just how grave the situation has become. It signals to the rest of the party that defending the indefensible is no longer a viable strategy. And it's not just the politicians who are backing away. It is the legal minds that Trump relies on for credibility. Legal experts, whether conservative or liberal, are unified in their assessment. They explain that this rejection by the Supreme Court is one of the clearest, most decisive judicial rebukes since the historic United States versus Nixon case. Listen to Andrew McCarthy.
He is a former federal prosecutor and a conservative columnist who often defends Trump's positions. He went on national television and declared that this decision was so solid, so airtight, that there is no avenue for appeal.
He used the phrase end of the road. When a defender like McCarthy tells you it's over, it is truly over. There is no magic trick left to play. Then there is Alan Dershowitz, the famous constitutional scholar who actually defended Trump during his impeachment trial in the Senate. Even he couldn't spin this. He described the court's words as devastating for any idea of presidential immunity. He noted that the ruling leaves no room for ambiguity. When you have experts from both sides of the aisle, people who usually agree on nothing, using words like devastating, solid, and end of the road, it shows that the situation is deadly serious. Trump isn't just losing emotion. He is losing the argument entirely. The legal shield has been smashed, and the experts are standing over the pieces, shaking their heads. The consensus is absolute. The strategy has failed, and the consequences are imminent.
And just to render this entire scenario even more surreal, to add a layer of absolute shock to this already volatile mix, we must turn our eyes to an unlikely figure in this drama. Warren Buffett.
Now, Warren Buffett is a man who famously avoids the mudslinging of political arenas. He almost never comments on the legal entanglements of Donald Trump. He stays in his lane, laser focused on the economy, on value investing, and on the steady growth of the markets. But this time something changed. This time the Oracle of Omaha decided he could not stay silent through Berkshire Hathaway. Buffett made a calculated decision to issue a statement. Why? Because for him, this ruling by the Supreme Court wasn't just about one man's freedom. It was a decisive moment for the entire American experiment. He affirmed with crystal clarity that this decision serves as a reminder to every single American leader of a simple, fundamental truth. No one is above the law. But Buffett didn't stop at the moral argument. He went straight to the wallet, straight to the heart of what makes America rich and powerful. He explained that the markets, the very engine of our prosperity, depend entirely on the respect for the law. Contracts, investments, trade, they all rely on a predictable set of rules. When this principle is called into question, when a leader claims they can rewrite the rules on a whim, it is the whole foundation of our economic system that is threatened. Chaos is the enemy of wealth. Buffett explained that investors need to pay very close attention the moment any person, no matter how powerful or popular, claims immunity from justice. To him, that is a flashing warning sign. That is a red flag for instability. Remember, this is Warren Buffett we are talking about. This is a man who built a legendary reputation by staying meticulously away from partisan disputes. He doesn't get involved in the daily noise. The fact that he is intervening now at this specific juncture shows clearly that he perceives a real, tangible economic danger in Trump's position. He sees the King Trump theory not just as a political threat, but as a financial liability. And the market listened. Money talks, as they say, and the response was immediate. Following his declaration in the Supreme Court's ruling, the stock of Berkshire Hathaway actually jumped by 2% during after-hours trading. That might sound like a small number to the uninitiated, but for a company of that size, it represents billions of dollars in value. It suggests that the sophisticated investors, the people who move the real money, share his analysis. They breathe a sigh of relief. They were signaling that the stability of the legal system is worth more to them than the political survival of any single politician. The message from Wall Street was clear. We prefer the rule of law over the rule of one man. This confrontation we are witnessing is not merely a captivating judicial thriller to be watched with a bucket of popcorn. It is a seismic event with serious, immediate consequences for the very functioning of our democracy. We have moved beyond legal theories and economic warnings. Now we are dealing with the raw political fallout. First, consider the immediate impact on the campaign trail. Trump is already suffering significant blowback from his multiple indictments. While his core base remains loyal, his broader popularity is taking a hit. Republican representatives, the people who have to run for re-election in swing districts, are beginning to sweat. They are looking at the 2024 election map and seeing a nightmare scenario. This ruling amplifies the tension to a breaking point. And how does Trump respond to this delicate moment? He doubles down. He is attacking the Supreme Court with a ferocity we have never seen before, targeting even his own appointed justices. He accuses them of disobedience. He hints at corruption. But here is the problem with that strategy. It doesn't strengthen his image of strength. It paints a picture of chaos. Most Americans, even those who don't follow politics closely, still respect the Supreme Court. They view it as an essential pillar of the system, a final arbiter. Even if they disagree with specific decisions, they respect the institution. When a candidate for president declares war on the Supreme Court, accusing them of being part of a conspiracy, he risks alienating the very voters he needs to win the suburban moderates who want stability, not a constitutional crisis. You can be absolutely certain that the Democrats are watching this unfold with a mixture of disbelief and opportunity. They are going to seize this situation with both hands. This ruling is a gift to their narrative. They will use it to prove once and for all that Trump believes he is above the law and has zero respect for the Constitution. And the most damaging part, they won't even have to use their own words. They will use the words of the Supreme Court justices, Trump's own justices, to back up their arguments. This decision is destined to become the centerpiece of the Democratic campaign against him. It provides the legal proof to support the claim that Trump sees himself as a dictator in waiting. Expect to see these quotes from Chief Justice Roberts plastered across attack ads, recited in speeches, and shouted in debates. Even the Supreme Court says he thinks he's a king. That is a devastating slogan. But there is another victim in this crossfire, the Supreme Court itself. Chief Justice John Roberts has spent his entire career trying to keep the court out of the mud of partisan battles. He wanted to present the institution as rising above political influence. But by ruling so decisively against Trump, the court has been dragged right into the center of a political hurricane. Trump and his most ardent supporters are now ready to tear down the court's reputation, insinuating bias and questioning their motives. This complicates the image of neutrality that the institution relies on for its authority. Yet Roberts likely calculated that he had no other choice. Faced with a situation where the fundamental principle of equal justice under law was being challenged, he had to act. If the court had sided with Trump, if they had granted him that immunity, their credibility would have been shattered beyond repair. They would have been seen as accomplices to a cover-up. Roberts chose the storm of Trump's anger over the silence of complicity. This situation casts a blinding spotlight on the absolute bedrock principle of American democracy. No person is above the law. Sounds like a cliche, a phrase we hear in civics class and forget. But today it is the only thing standing between order and tyranny. At the very heart of this problem lies a terrifying question, one that keeps constitutional scholars up at night. Can a president simply declare himself immune from prosecution whenever he feels like it? Can he wrap himself in the flag and commit crimes with impunity? If Trump had won this argument, if the court had bowed to his pressure, it could have fundamentally shattered the entire structure of our constitutional system. We have to look back to the beginning to understand the stakes. The founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, they didn't fight a bloody revolution against King George III just to turn around and install a new monarch in the White House. They specifically, intentionally, and passionately rejected the idea of an untouchable leader. They built a system of checks and balances with a judicial branch capable of controlling the excesses of the executive, precisely because they knew that power corrupts. The idea that a president could commit crimes without consequence would have taken a sledgehammer to that entire framework. It would have rendered the Constitution a worthless piece of paper. But Donald Trump has always been deeply uncomfortable with these limitations. Throughout his life, in business and in politics, he has sought total control. He chafes at restrictions. He views checks and balances not as safeguards, but as obstacles to be bulldozed. If absolute immunity had been granted by the Supreme Court, it would have been a massive reinforcement of authoritarian power. It would have validated his worldview. It would have opened the floodgates for future presidents to commit crimes without fear, knowing that the robe of the presidency would shield them from the reach of the law. The implications of this case, therefore, go far beyond Donald Trump himself. This isn't just about one man trying to stay out of jail in 2024. It is about shaping the structure of the American government for generations to come. Every time Trump ignores norms, every time he attacks institutions or claims to be above the law, he is stress testing our democratic system. He is weakening the guardrails. He is beginning to normalize behavior that was previously considered totally unacceptable. Imagine just for a moment a world where Trump had succeeded. Imagine if he could claim absolute immunity. What would stop the next president, Democrat or Republican, from doing the same? What would stop a future leader from silencing critics, accepting bribes, or using the military for personal gain, and then simply waving the immunity card to make the charges disappear? If presidents could simply commit crimes at will, what break would prevent another leader from following this dark path? These actions don't just vanish when Trump leaves power. They become precedent. They become part of our new reality. And that is a prospect that is extremely dangerous. The terrifying reality we must confront is that the actions of a president do not simply vanish into the ether when he leaves office. They scar the landscape. They become part of our new national reality. And in this case, that reality is extremely dangerous. You see, democracy does not rely solely on written laws or the text of the Constitution. It relies heavily on norms, on traditions, and on an unspoken honor system. It functions on the assumption that the people we elect to power will respect the rules, even when those rules are inconvenient, even when those rules hurt them personally. When those norms collapse, when a leader decides that the code of conduct no longer applies to him, it is democracy itself that begins to waver and crack. This is the precipice we are standing on. Trump is effectively telling the country that the only rule that matters is power, and that legal constraints are merely suggestions for the weak. And as we look toward the horizon of the 2024 elections, it is becoming blindingly obvious that this philosophy will have massive tangible consequences. We are still months away from the first votes being cast, but the narrative that is being constructed right now in the courtrooms and in the headlines is going to influence the outcome of that race more than any campaign ad or rally speech. Think about the story that is playing out before the eyes of the American electorate. It is not a story of a triumphant leader marching to victory. It is a story of Donald Trump fighting a desperate war against every major institution in the country, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the local prosecutors, and now the Supreme Court itself. And crucially, the story shows him losing. This foreshadows deep trouble for the Republican Party. Why? Because history tells us a simple truth about American voters. They generally do not reward chaos. They do not vote for dysfunction. When they go to the ballot box, the majority of people are looking for stability. They are looking for competence. They want a government that works, not a daily reality show of legal grievances and constitutional crises. And right now, Donald Trump is offering neither stability nor competence. He is offering a promise of continued conflict, a pledge that his second term would be nothing more than a revenge tour against the judicial system. So expect the Democrats to pivot. Expect them to sharpen their message. They are going to look at this wreckage and present a very simple alternative centered on the restoration of the rule of law. After years of noise and fury under Trump, they will argue that a vote for them is a vote for normally. They will argue that it means a Department of Justice that can finally function independently without fear or favor. They will promise an end to the constitutional crisis, an end to the relentless attacks on the Supreme Court, and a return to boring, stable governance. This message is powerful. It cuts through the noise, and it has the potential to resonate deeply with a wide swath of voters, including those moderate Republicans who are exhausted. They are tired of defending the indefensible. They are tired of waking up every morning to a new scandal. And when they see the Supreme Court, the crown jewel of conservatism, saying enough is enough, it gives them permission to walk away. So here is the stark reality of the situation we find ourselves in today. The dust is settling, and the picture is becoming clearer. The Supreme Court has just delivered Donald Trump the single worst judicial defeat of his life. And let's not gloss over the irony. This blow was struck by the very hands he lifted up. His own appointees, the judges he bragged about, the jurists he claimed would see the world through his eyes, have looked at his arguments and rejected them. They have ruled against him, not on a technicality, but on the core principle of his defense. But we must understand that this moment is about so much more than a courtroom loss. It is not just about legal briefs, oral arguments, or the minutiae of constitutional law. It is about whether the fundamental American principle, the idea that has held this diverse, chaotic nation together for 2.5 centuries, remains valid. That principle is simple. No one is above the law. If Trump's claim of absolute immunity had been accepted, if the court had bowed to his will, it would have been the equivalent of taking a match to the Constitution. It would have been a declaration that the document written in Philadelphia in 1787 no longer matters when a strong man enters the room. It would mean entering a terrifying new world where presidents can commit crimes, bribery, treason, assault without ever being held accountable. It would mean that the Oval Office transforms into a sanctuary for criminal behavior. This, therefore, is not solely about Donald Trump's legal troubles. It is not about his bank accounts or his campaign schedule. It is about the existential question of whether we truly have a system of checks and balances, or if we are simply left to the mercy of whoever manages to accumulate the most power. Are we a nation of laws or a nation of men? Trump tried to force the country to answer that question in his favor. He tried to force the system to bend until it broke. But the system pushed back. The institutions, battered and bruised as they are, held the line, and now the implications of that resistance are rippling out. So keep a very close eye on this case. Do not look away. The intensity is ramping up. With the intervention of Warren Buffett and the immediate reaction of the markets, we are seeing that the smart money understands the stakes. They know that a country without the rule of law is a country where business cannot thrive. This story is far from over. In fact, the Supreme Court's ruling was not the end of the book. It was merely the end of the chapter. We are now turning the page to the climax. The coming weeks are going to be absolutely crucial.
We are entering the end game of this legal saga, and the tension is palpable. The Supreme Court has cleared the board of the distractions, and now the real game begins.
Trump's legal team, those high-priced lawyers who promised him the moon, now have to scramble to decide on a completely new strategy.
Their Plan A, claiming total immunity, has been incinerated. Their Plan B, delaying until after the election by tying up the courts with constitutional questions, has just hit a massive roadblock.
They are running out of cards to play, and the clock is ticking louder than ever. Simultaneously, his political allies are staring down the barrel of a definitive choice. They have to decide right now if they are going to continue to defend a man who has been stripped of his legal armor.
Do they link their arms with a sinking ship? Do they continue to parrot the talking points that the Supreme Court, including the conservative justices, just debunked? Or do they quietly start to back away, hoping to salvage their own careers?
From the wreckage, we are already seeing the cracks with Lindsey Graham. Expect those cracks to turn into fissures as the reality of the situation sets in. And let's talk about the trials themselves without the magical shield of immunity to pause the proceedings. The federal cases are going to accelerate like a car with a bra line cut. The special counsel is ready. The evidence has been gathered. The witnesses are prepped.
For months, Trump has managed to keep the actual facts of the alleged crimes out of the headlines by focusing on the procedural arguments about his powers. But now the conversation shifts from can he be tried to is he guilty.
That is a conversation Trump is desperate to avoid because the evidence in the federal cases, particularly regarding the classified documents and election interference, is overwhelming and clear. The stakes have truly never been higher. We are not talking about fines or slaps on the wrist. We are talking about the potential incarceration of a former president. The evidence has never been clearer, and the outcome remains terrifyingly unpredictable. Every motion filed, every statement made in the coming days carries the weight of history. What we are witnessing in real time is a violent collision. It is the collision between the unshakable conviction of one man who believes in his heart of hearts that he is above the law and the stubborn 2550-year-old commitment of the American experiment to ensure that no one is. Trump is charging full speed at the institutions, betting that his force of personality can shatter the rules. But the institutions, backed by the Supreme Court and echoed by the warnings of Warren Buffett, are standing firm like a stone wall. This is not just a legal procedural. It is a test of national character. It is a stress test for the Republic. And as we move into these final critical hours and days, the question is no longer about what Trump will do. We know what he will do. He will attack. The question is, will the system hold? And so we arrive at the conclusion of this chapter, but it is merely the opening act of the most dangerous drama in American history. As we look at the road ahead, the reality is stark. The Supreme Court has ripped away the veil. They have stripped Donald Trump of the one thing he valued more than his wealth, more than his brand, and perhaps even more than the presidency itself, his perceived immunity. They have reduced him in the eyes of the law to something he detests, being a private citizen. Just a man who must answer for his actions, a man who must stand in the dock, and a man who is subject to the same penal code as the people he once governed. This is the ultimate nightmare for a figure who has spent his entire life constructing a myth of invulnerability. Trump's power has always relied on the perception that he plays by a different set of rules, that he can bend reality to his will. But the law is stubborn. It relies on facts, not rallies. It relies on evidence, not true social posts.
And as the federal machinery begins to turn unencumbered by the stalling tactics of the past 2 years, we are about to see what happens when that myth collides with the cold, hard walls of a federal courtroom.
Warren Buffett saw this coming. His warning was not just to comment on current events. It was a prophecy about the fragility of our system. He understands that the United States is not an economy with a government attached. It is a government of laws that allows an economy to flourish. If you remove the cornerstone, the concept that no man is a king, the entire building from the stock market to your retirement fund begins to shake. The stability we take for granted is not guaranteed. It is something that must be fought for, defended, and reaffirmed in every generation. The next few months will not be quiet. They will be deafening. We will see attacks on the judiciary that make the current rhetoric look tame. We will see a political campaign that merges completely with a criminal defense strategy. But amidst the noise and the fury, do not lose sight of the signal. The signal is that the system is working. It is straining. It is groaning under the pressure, but the gears of justice are turning. The Supreme Court held the line. The Constitution remains the supreme law of the land. We are living through history. Decades from now, students will open their textbooks to this specific moment. They will read about the day the Supreme Court said no to a president. They will read about the day the business world, led by Buffett, drew a line in the sand. The question that remains, the question that only time will answer, is how the chapter ends. Will it end with the reaffirmation of democracy, or will it end in the chaos that Trump's critics fear? The answer lies in the days ahead. The battle lines are drawn. The evidence is ready, and for the first time, there are no more places to hide. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the crisis that is reshaping America. If you want to stay ahead of the curve and understand the forces moving the world, make sure you are subscribed. The story is just beginning, and you will not want to miss what happens.